Hi guys! Welcome back to yet another fun DIY sailboat refit video here aboard good old Athena. This week, amongst other things, I'm gonna attempt to turn this into one of these awesome laminated beams. Please excuse all of the dust on these, but underneath that dust, these are beautiful laminated teak beams that help stiffen up the cabin top. The astute might have noted that this is not teak. This is a different species of wood, but we'll get back to what this is and why I'm using this rather than teak a little later in the video. In last weekend's video, I removed the core in this knee because it was soaking wet. I prepped the surface and made a new core. So far this week, I've repeated that process on the starboard side. I've got the surface all prepped and ready. And I've also made another plywood core, a plywood core for the starboard side. The next step in this little mini project is to get the forward side of these sealed up with some epoxy and also the outside edge. We'll get back to the knees in a minute. First, let's work on the laminated beam. What you see here is 7 strips of yellow balau. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is 6 to 8 millimeters thick. I cut this earlier this week from a big plank of the stuff. This is what the untreated balau looks like compared to the varnished teak beam. Before deciding to go ahead with this, I made a small sample, and this is what the balau looks like varnished. I think that is a pretty good match on color. I've only got a couple of coats of varnish on here, and I don't have the satin finish that I have on the beams. Once I've got a few more coats on here and the satin finish, I think the color is going to be very, very close. I've got a lot of work ahead of me and not a lot of time, so let's go ahead and engage turbo mode. It is the next day. I am so excited to see how this beam turned out that I actually had a hard time falling asleep last night. I'm sure some of you out there right now are going, but wait a minute, Mess, you forgot to take into account spring back. So when you remove the supports, this is no longer going to match the curvature of the cabin top. I think, or at least I hope, that's not going to be the case here. There is a rule of thumb that says that the degree of spring back is inversely proportional to the square of the number of laminations. So say you had, for instance, only 2 laminations, that would mean you would lose roughly a quarter of the curvature. But I've got 7 laminations. Carry the one. All joking aside, if I'm not mistaken, that means I'll lose roughly 2% of the curvature on this, and it's not exactly a sharp bend, so I think we'll be fine. The beam is now only being held in place by the clamps. I know it's pretty difficult to see because of all the plastic, but I think this thing looks pretty dang spiffy. And if I use the same spacing, I've actually got room for another one of these beams right around here, about this much forward of the companionway. I think that will look pretty sweet, but let's see how this turns out first. A little bit of cleanup and this should look like $1,000,000. Feast your eyes on this. The beam turned out absolutely perfect. After having rounded over the edges, the new beam is a dead ringer for the old ones. Right around where you see that blue glove dangling from the companionway is where I can put another beam. That would bring me up to 4. I think that would look very spiffy. Some of you might have noticed that the beautiful new laminated beam, which is just temporarily held in place by these clamps right now, stops kind of abruptly right here. That is because there's going to be a piece of plywood right here that's going to separate the head from the saloon. I want standing headroom in the shower that's going to be right here, and that means there is no room for the beam. Hopefully this weekend I will be able to put in place the piece of plywood that's going to go here. It's going to be a nice curved piece of plywood. And after that is in place, well then I can go ahead and trim the new beam, get it varnished, and get it adhered in place. One final remark about the beam before we move on to a different topic. I made the beam out of these planks here. These are used for decks, the house kind, not the boat kind. And because I used this stuff, the entire laminated beam only cost me the equivalent of $35 US. For the next couple of minutes, I'm going to turn my attention back to the core for the knees. I want to get these sealed up before mounting them, but there's no need to seal up the entire core. This side is going to be facing forward on the port knee, and that is going to get adhered in place with some thickened epoxy to the old tapping. So there could theoretically be some little voids in here, and I want to make sure I seal up this side. I also want to make sure I seal up this edge here because that's going to be facing out towards the hull, but there is no need to seal up this side. I've cleaned up both of the cores and I've rounded over the edges. I've rounded over the outside edges here to be able to better seal them up, and the inside edges to be able to lay up glass. To seal the epoxy, I'm going to apply 3 coats of epoxy, ideally wet on tacky to avoid a lot of prep work. I'm going to be using West Systems 105 resin. I've always had good luck with the products from West System, that's why I'm sticking with them, but there are plenty of other brands out there. There is not a lot to this, but like I said, if I can apply the 3 coats wet on tacky, I'm going to make life a little bit easier for myself, because if the epoxy cures, well then I'll have to sand and prep the surface before I can apply the next coat. That is 1 coat applied on both of the cores. Later tonight I can swing by and apply a second coat. It's a few days later. I've got 3 coats of epoxy on the cores. They're ready for the last little bit of sanding, and then we can get those mounted. But first, there's something else I want to do, something I've very much been looking forward to. And that is, of course, to get the piece of plywood that's going to go here in place. It's just going to be the corner here, but with that corner in place, I can get rid of this annoying thing, and I can also start figuring out the layout in the head. I've got the piece of plywood I'm going to be using right there, but I don't feel like wasting that giant piece of plywood, so to start with, I'm going to make a little bit of a prototype. The plan is to do exactly the same with this corner as I did with the corner on the settee with the curved to 45-degree angles. But the piece of plywood I've got in here, it's got the grain orientation on the outer veneer running in this direction, which is not really super awesome. But for this particular piece, it doesn't matter because all of this is going to get covered in a very thin piece of decorative plywood. So let's see how this works out. Something like that. I think that's gonna look pretty dang spiffy. As you can see, there is already a little bit of splintering here, but like I mentioned, it doesn't really matter for this. As you can see on this little test piece I made a while back, the splintering on the outer veneer has absolutely no influence on strength. Once the thickened epoxy in here has cured, this thing is basically indestructible. This is the biggest piece of plywood I have ever curved, so there is a decent chance I'm gonna mess this up because there are some angles here to take into consideration, and also there's the height because the cabin tub is curved. I think my best bet here is to divide and conquer, so I will curve and bend the plywood today, apply the thickened epoxy, let that cure overnight, and then tomorrow I can see if I can sneak up on the measurements, because until that thickened epoxy has cured, the plywood is kind of fragile. Plywood thusly curved. I am committed now. This doesn't feel quite as flexible as I would like it to, but I'm just gonna cross my fingers and hope that it'll be okay. I've made myself 3 little helpers. I'm hoping these will help me to bend the plywood to exactly the radius I want. This is nothing special, it is just a bit of plywood and some larch. In order for these little helpers to not become a permanent part of the plywood, I'm just going to wrap them in a little bit of duct tape to be able to get them off of there, even if I get some epoxy on. I'm not saying that this will fail for sure, but there's certainly a chance it will. So to make sure that my plywood here doesn't get permanently attached to the cabin sole, I'm just going to put down some plastic. This should be all ready for epoxy now, but I'm very interested to see if this will in fact bend. I don't know if the mic is picking it up, but there is definitely some cracking sounds, which are slightly terrifying. I can honestly say that was a little bit terrifying, but at least it looks like she bends. So now we just need to get some epoxy in there and bend her one last time. Summer is officially over. It is cold enough that I need to start switching over to the fast hardener. I'm not gonna thicken this up too much. I've got gravity on my side here, and it's gonna be easier to work with if it's a little bit runny. I think I've got enough epoxy smushed in here now, so let's go ahead and do this. I'm replacing the clamps with a few screws because I really don't want anything to come loose during the night. If this doesn't work out for the separation between the head and the saloon, I could just turn it into some kind of weird canoe. Good morning, guys. Yesterday afternoon I was all set to adhere the core for the knees in place, but turns out I was out of paper cups. I sanded and prepped the cores, so a little later today, adhering these in place should be fairly straightforward. But first, let's just turn our attention back to the canoe. It feels like the epoxy has cured nicely, so let's get the little helpers out of here and see if this fits. The duct tape did a good job of preventing these from adhering to the plywood. They are pretty easy to remove. Of course, this thing is not gonna fit right now because it is a little bit oversized, but yeah, it looks pretty cool. There is some cracking here, but that's okay. The first measurement where the canoe is gonna butt up against the bulkhead here is gonna be the easiest one. It looks like that is gonna be 192. Using the magic of lasers, I will grab a bunch more measurements. I've transferred the measurements onto my plywood here. This is almost guaranteed not going to be an exact match, but that's okay. A little bit of thickened epoxy and the tabbing will hide my sins. So let's go ahead and get this cut. Here goes nothing. Fingers crossed. Booyah! Okay, there is a little bit of a gap up there, but holy god dang! This thing looks pretty dang spiffy. This right here is why I enjoy doing all of this work. This feels so satisfying. And knowing that Ava and I are going to be living here aboard Athena in about 1 year and 7 months, and I get to look at that every day and think, hey, I built that. That feels amazing. Let's go ahead and get this permanently attached. The first step is to remove some material from over here to make room for the glassed butt joint. I've got everything lined up just the way I want it. But I need a little bit of help to keep everything in place while I'm laying up glass, and for that I've wrapped some stir sticks in some duct tape. Forward side is all glassed, and I've also applied peel ply. The aft facing side, the inside of the head, is gonna have to wait until tomorrow. My plan was to adhere the core for the knees in place in the end of this video, but unfortunately I am out of video shooting time for this week, so that is gonna have to be the beginning of next weekend's video. But I hope you guys enjoyed the laminated beam and the plywood kerfing, but yeah, that is going to be the end of this video. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like. See you!